that having a full range of saturation is not a criterion for excellent painting. That we know that was that the whole range of tonalist painters whose saturation was kept very, very close and usually low. Let's explore the saturation of colors and how we can make this work in our paintings. To understand how saturation works, let's begin with the color wheel. And let's begin with the three parts of color. We have the hues of the color, the saturations of those hues, and the values of those hues at each saturation. The traditional color wheel shows us the saturations relatively full. But when those saturations fall into a different kind of light, either a stronger light or a weaker light or no light, the saturation changes. And when those complements are mixed into each other, the saturation changes. And we know the complements to be those colors opposite each other on the wheel. We know also that any color opposite a complement, whether it's directly opposite or to the right or left of the complement, will yield, when mixed with the complement, some degree of desaturation. So we're dealing with degrees of saturation, from fully saturated, as we see on the wheel, to not so saturated, desaturated. And that desaturation can happen in a number of degrees, from fully saturated to only a slightly saturated, to only about half saturated, to very desaturated, to barely any hue at all, to fully neutral. That's the pattern hues will take when the complements are mixed. And there's another pattern that can happen when a fully saturated hue falls into shadow or is hit by a very strong light. Let's take red-violet as an example. Here's red-violet in its high saturated form at its registration pretty close to what we see on the color wheel. When we throw red-violet into a little bit of shadow, we get something like this. And so, yes, it does lose a degree of saturation. If we throw it into more shadow, we get something like this. On the other hand, if we take the same red-violet and we throw it into a light, let's say about a halftone 3 light, we get something like this. And then if we throw it into a stronger light, say a halftone 2 light, we get something like this. If we throw it into a very strong light, say a halftone 1 light, we get something like this. If red-violet is appearing under a center light on a shiny surface, in that area where the light is actually reflecting off the surface, we get something like this. In other words, we get no hue at all. So that gives us the definition of desaturation, when hue begins to disappear, when the full saturation of the hue is no longer evident and we're perceiving only a portion of the saturation of the hue, then that hue is desaturated. Let's look at the other pattern that desaturation will take. Here we have the wheel I developed of all the 12 hues we find on a traditional color wheel, and what happens to them when one of their complements is added into them. As we see here, again, going back to the red-violet, as a complement is added into it, a bit of the hue disappears. Let's see that in action. Going back to our fully desaturated line, here, if we add a bit of complement to that, we get something like this. A slight desaturation. Some of the red-violet has gone away. The yellow-green that we added to it as its complement has taken away a portion, a small portion, of the hue. If we add more of the yellow-green to it, we get something like this. Less hue than we see in this. And if we add more yellow-green at that same value level, I did not emphasize that, but the complements, the two complements must be in the same value level, or at least very close in value, or else it will change the value as well as the saturation. So I add more yellow-green, and we get something like this. And then if I add an equal tinting strength of yellow-green, we get this, neutral. So the definition of saturation has to do with the amount of hue that is perceptible within any color we're looking at. And so if that amount of hue is as close to 100% as is possible, it's fully saturated. As that amount of hue is not perceptible, we don't perceive as much hue because of something else has happened to it, it's going to be desaturated. And that saturation is going to appear in degrees. All hues behave that way. We could take the full time and go through every single hue and show that progression. But that's something you can do on your own. There's one additional thing we need to add to this explanation, and that is that at every value level, saturations and desaturations can happen. Just because we desaturate a color doesn't mean we have to change its value. It doesn't mean it's going to change its value, providing we have both colors we use for the desaturation at the same value. So let's show you here what happens at different value levels with this red-violet. Red-violet then, when we desaturate it at its most saturated level, which is at that particular value, then this is what we get. We desaturate a value darker, and this is what we get. Desaturate another value darker, and this is what we get. Well, that's actually about 2 or 3 values darker, but you get the point. Now let's go back to the lighter portion. We desaturate at this lighter level. This is what we get. We desaturate at the next lighter level, and this is what we get. So here we have illustrated how every hue at any value level can be desaturated in increments in degrees at its value level. And learning how to do that is one of the main skills that can give you all sorts of freedom as a painter. We often use the term neutralizing when we're talking about desaturating colors in paintings, but there are 3 terms that are used these days for talking about saturation. One of the most popular terms that's used is chroma. Then another term that was used almost exclusively when I was first studying art is intensity. And it's the word that I've used most often when talking about saturation. But actually, the word saturation is clearer about what the concept really is. Now, there are some misconceptions about saturation. One misconception is that when something is desaturated, that it's totally neutral, and that's not true. You see here in this painting that most of you are familiar with of Richard Schmid's, there's a lot of desaturation, but it's certainly not mostly neutral. Another misconception is that when we talk about something being saturated or more saturated, a lot of people think that means really saturated, hugely saturated, and that's not true either. Once again, looking at the Richard Schmid painting here, if we pull our color reader over and we read the saturation in this building, you see it feels saturated, but then we look in the color reader and we see that it is less than 50% saturated. So when we use those terms, saturation, chroma, intensity, let's use those with the concept or the awareness of the full range of possibility, not in any limited way. The full range of from fully saturated all the way down to neutral. Now, remembering that saturation is one part of the characteristics of color, saturation, value, and hue. We do have painters in our history that were not concerned with using degrees of saturation, and those were the tonalists. James McNeill Whistler was a tonalist in a part of his development. He went through several experimental stages during his lifetime. Now, this painting is typical of one of his tonal paintings. Tonalism's concern is more with value and creating mood with value, or creating an atmosphere of a sort with value. But often you'll find in tonal paintings, the saturation of all the colors will be very low. Let's explore that in this Whistler painting. So I'll just pull the color reader over right here. I want you to pay attention in the color reader, of course, to our little saturation reader right here. Just let your eyes move back and forth. So when I hit the any area, you see right here, see how desaturated, it's less than 50% saturated. Now, as I move the reader around, you can see the entire piece is registering in that desaturated zone, in that desaturation zone. If you needed to give it a percentage, you might say that the whole piece is within that range of maybe 20 to 30% saturated hue. Even this area right here that feels more saturated isn't. In fact, it's less saturated. It's just lighter, and it takes on a different hue. So it's difficult to discuss the role of saturation without also discussing the role of hue. But remember, saturation is the amount of hue. And so sometimes there can be different hues there, side by side. For example, there's green beside red here. They can emphasize each other in hue, whereas they may be a very low saturation. So I want us to distinguish the difference between when there is hue against hue that's causing our attention to go to an area, or when there is saturation against saturation. I want to focus our study on how saturation itself, as a component of color, can influence how we see one area of color, or one area of hue. I often refer to this painting, The Oyster Gatherers by John Singer Sargent, because it is unsurpassed in so many ways when it comes to masterful composing of paintings. It really is a prime example of how the degree of saturation affects what color does to color. Now I'm going to show you a little demonstration here to drive that point home. Now I'm bringing in my color reader. The color reader reads the three parts of color. It reads the three things that color does to color: the value, in this little band right here. And this little gizmo reads the saturation and the hue. Now, you can see it reads the hue going in this direction. So I'll show you that. If I move it in that direction, you see it reads hues. But then when I bring it back and forth between the two bands, it reads the saturation. So here is zero saturation, no saturation. In other words, we see no hue. But we move it back towards the outer band, and we begin to see more hue, more hue, more hue, more hue, more hue, till we get the fully saturation where we see 100% saturation of the hue. That's how it reads. Now let's see how that reads Sargent. How does it read the saturation of this woman's face? I might note here that that color is repeated, especially with all the skin tones. We can see he's used pretty much that same saturation with all the skin tones. And in the shadow area is pretty much the same value. So let's just focus on this woman's face. You can see that it is almost half saturated, you might say. It's a little bit more than half saturated. If I bring it down like this, you see there it gets totally neutral. But then if I take that same color in that same color range, pull it over here, at that value, and that's important. At that value, it's at the fullest saturation it can be. If it were receiving enough light so we could see the full saturation, this is the hue that we would be reading. So this is the actual hue, but then when we desaturate, it changes to this. What I want to show you now is how if I change the saturation in her surroundings, it will also change the way we read this, although the color itself will not change. That's what saturation does to saturation. Now, if I take all the saturation away, let's do that first. If I take all the saturation away, we have this. It's not unfamiliar to you. You can still read it. You still know what it is. It's just that we have no color at all, no hue at all. But we add the hue back, and we can see that it's much richer now. Let's throw that background into a fuller saturation. And I want you to just keep your eye right here on her face and watch the feeling of how this changes when I throw a higher saturation into just the background. Did you notice how that seems to feel much darker and even duller? Let's pull the color reader back in. Now let's read that area. Did you notice right here? Notice this mark right here as I read that area. You notice that mark doesn't really change. I'm going to throw it back now into Sargent's version. And let's bring it back and read that again. And watch this right here. As I read that area, you see it moved just a little bit. It was affected just a little bit. But in essence, the saturation doesn't change. What changed was our perception. By throwing the surroundings into a much higher saturation, these images appear to feel much darker and much duller, although in reality, when we test them, they're not. Let's actually test the saturation of the area around these people, especially as the skin tones I'm looking at more than anything else, because they're the ones that have the higher saturation and are most affected by the saturation of the hues around them. So let's pull the color reader again and let me show you something. Of course, we've already read this and we see this at this saturation. But then when I read the saturation around her here, do you see how much lower it gets? It drops down a notch. There's not as much hue here and here and here. You see, as I continue to read, you see the saturation stays in this more desaturated area, even in the sky area here. And as I move it all around, you see that saturation, even though the value changes here, it gets lighter. a value change. Well, value changes right here, really. You see there, it gets lighter. But the saturation is actually lower. So that what that tells us then is that our perception of the brilliance of the skin, the almost glowing quality of the shadow tones in the skin, feels more brilliant because it's not totally saturated, but it's just a bit, just an increment more saturated than the area around it. I want to close this out with a little experiment here to show you visually why we saw that work with the skin tones of the woman getting more brilliant right in front of our eyes. Same hues around her, but those hues at a different saturation. So what I've done here, I've created 3 blocks, and I'm going to bring the color reader over and show you what's in them. So we'll just let the color reader read. Right here, you see I've got a fully saturated block of red-orange. It's at about a half tone free. You see right here in the value range, and all 3 of these you see are half tone free in the value range. This second block is about half saturated or half desaturated. Either way you want to say it's the same thing. And then this one is almost totally desaturated. A little bit of that red-orange hue in it, still at that same value. I tried to estimate on these the same value surrounding the woman in Sargent's painting. I took a sample of Sargent's woman's face, and here it is right here on the color reader. This is exactly the color that we see in the photo of Sargent's painting. So I want to show you now. Watch this. At the same value, at a high saturation of the same hue, I'll put a splotch right here. I'll go over to the one that is somewhat desaturated, same value, same hue, about 50% desaturated. And I want you to watch. You can see perceive the difference between the same color. See how this color changes, or our perception of it changes when we put it more in a desaturated area than it feels or than we perceive it when it's in the more saturated area. I'm going to put it in the almost totally desaturated area. You see how we can feel like we're really seeing more of the hue of red-orange. Luminous quality of the full saturation is so strong it dulls this down. But you see over here, with this having very little saturation, we feel this much brighter, as if it feels that it's more saturated than it really is. So I just wanted to show you that little experiment to wrap this up and to let you see that desaturation actually enhances saturation. Value, hue, and saturation work together. And we try to separate the way we talk about them when we're trying to understand them individually. And so we're trying to understand saturation individually, but sometimes it's both the saturation and the value that are causing us to see something either emphasized or the way we see it, because we know that a lighter value is going, if there's a dark image surrounded by a lighter value, it's going to appear darker than it would if it were surrounded by a darker value. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.